yeah, I heard these things, but I don't know what to say. At the time, I knew, I knew what Steph had gone through, and she was assaulted by him. You can call it an incident or whatever. But then the same thing, like, that she had gotten or attempted to get him banned from the gym there in Vegas when he showed up years later.
He could have been in jail a decade ago for some of these things, and he was, but he was let off.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to be like very honest and vulnerable. Like, I didn't know how to respond to what Steph seemed to be asking. She didn't ask me this directly. It was just her complaining about her frustrations of feeling unsafe, feeling insecure around this person, feeling like the climbing community hadn't, turned him into this black sheep yet. He was still in good standing. He could still chum it up with anyone at the crag.
The thing that's really, I think, also has to be remembered is that, he's this master manipulator. But again, it was kind of like, well, what do we do about that as a climbing community?
I felt like she was asking me for help, in a way, or just like asking me to, impugn someone's reputation who had never met. I was like, Steph, if what you're telling me is true, then you need to go to the police. And her response was like, they don't do anything. Like, and it's true. It's supported by statistics. Like, most sexual assaults don't result in like prosecution. There is this like tough line of like, what do we do about this? Like, because vigilante justice isn't like a solution. Like, I'm not gonna, what was the climbing community supposed to do per se? Like, do they take Charlie out back behind the boulders and just beat him senseless? Or like, what is it that you're asking for people to do? Because the recourse to these crimes are through the justice system.
It's not just these victims that get this manipulation, I don't think. Like, he is able to be a chameleon because he knows that he needs the support of these bros or these buddies and things like that, and so he's able to, he's a mastermind way with stuff like
right.
this. And these sociopaths are.
Yeah.
So it's like,
everyone else is off the hook. It's
I mean,
convenient.
What I'd like to say is that, like, if we're gonna forgive these victims for being manipulated, which of course we are.
Forgive them.
You're not gonna go back to them and say, well, why did you?
Why would they need forgiveness? They didn't do anything. They are the victims and survivors of the violence.
But you have to understand that the person's whole life is that. Like, he is manipulating everybody around him. It's like this whole web, and it's clear.
Yeah, it's a web
of
complicity.
Was this like crazy web of who he revealed himself
and the men who enabled his behavior and didn't stop it or call him out need to be held accountable.
One of the interesting things about this is like there's the way that this article was written and the way a lot of this discourse is spoken about, it seems that people are more excited about like putting climbing culture and climbing community on trial versus this one guy who I think most people, it's safe to say, hadn't heard about before this. And I find that to be a very interesting like instinct, and it just speaks to like their cultural moment in a way that I think is very relevant. And you can see that in the way that like people like James and Honnold, their names are invoked in this article in a way that kind of they're used as like points of information, but they're also, their reputations are meant to take a hit by their proximity to Charlie, who is this malevolent sociopath. And I just have to question that kind of instinct and that style of shaming, or I don't know if shaming's the right word, but just wanting to place like this moral stain on those folks. And there's obviously this just question of proximity to all of these stories. And, like, had Honnold witnessed or been standing in the woods, like right next to this rape that happened, and did nothing about it, that would be one thing. But, if he's, 5 stories removed from hearing about it, or didn't even hear about it, but heard about something else down the telephone line, and, just still maintained some kind of cordial, friendly relationship when he saw Charlie at the crags, that's a very different thing. Like, those are 2 different people who would be there's this kind of flattening that takes place in order to indict the climbing community or the climbing world at large for this one individual's really terrible actions. And I just think that we need to like cool it with that a little bit. Like, you know, I saw an Instagram account that had been created after Charlie had been sentenced to life, showing the letters that some climbers that I know had written in support of his character. Now, these were written before Outside article came out, and so before a lot of the more, you know, difficult and terrible details, I think, were known publicly.
Oh.
At least in this way. And so, you know, yeah, those people, there's like this effort to kind of just shame them for doing that. You know, like, how could you? Like, you're part of the problem. But you're
no
right.
Shit.
Like, they are also victims of Charlie's.
Oh.
Like, they have been
Oh.
manipulated by his dark triad charisma.
So the really intellectual, deep-thinking men who have a podcast that we're listening to right now, Andrew Bisharat and Chris Kalous, who have podcasts on Patreon that you have to pay to listen to. So I decided to do that to see what they were talking about in this episode, where it's called Climbing's Worst People. And they're supposed to be talking about Charlie Barrett. But instead, for the first 22 minutes, so I'm not sure what's going to happen in the next, 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes after this. But so far, all they've talked about is how the larger climbing community should not be held accountable for this one man's awful behavior. No, his friends shouldn't be held accountable. Alex Honnold shouldn't be held accountable, no. In the expose that Outside Online published, Alex Honnold is reported to having said that he knew professional climbers who had been assaulted by Charlie. This is not just some fucked up situation of telephone. Yes, Andrew, the entire climbing community, including you, needs to be held accountable for maintaining grape culture. Because this conversation that you're having, you and Kalous are having, is maintaining and upholding grape culture by not admitting that the people around sexual abusers, sexual predators, yeah, there's a network of people around them that allow this behavior to happen by not holding that person accountable, by not taking seriously things that people say, like Alex Honnold brushing off what he heard around the campfire as just some climbing rumors. Alex Honnold, in the article, is reported to have said that he completely dismissed that this professional climber had gotten assaulted by Charlie. He said, that's crazy because she's strong and she can hold her own. Yeah, that's actually called victim blaming, and that's a huge part of grape culture. The myth that if you're smart and strong, then something like this would never happen to you. Being a victim survivor has nothing to do with whether or not somebody is smart or strong. None of this is surprising because Alex Honnold is the guy who told his girlfriend, now wife, that he would rather die climbing than take her emotional needs into account. This is the guy who in Free Solo described Sonny as, quote, cute, small, livens up the place, doesn't take up too much room. Someone on Reddit wrote that the Outside Online article is just a, quote, long, exhaustive list of people who repeatedly failed to hold this man accountable, end quote. The so-called lone wolf master manipulator is in jail. The spectacle of so-called justice has been delivered, but the structures remain in place. And the brotherhood of toxic masculinity still reigns supreme.